Welcome back, everyone. In his book, Christian Slaves, Muslim Masters, Robert C. Davis comments, interestingly, over this same generation, scholarship on Barbary Coast slavery has been tending in just the opposite direction of scholarship on slavery in the Americas. Some have suggested that for white Europeans, enslavement in the Maghreb was no more cruel or brutal than prison or even ordinary working life in much of Europe. Others have chosen to emphasize instances of Muslim masters' kind treatment of their bondsmen. History is, often as not, our present politics projected onto the past, and the ways in which the intellectual tide has flowed in different directions over these two sorts of slavery may well say more about our own times than about the world 300 years ago. To elaborate, Davis is discussing contrasting methodological developments among historians. His study looks at the enslavement of whites around the Mediterranean and points to scholarly trends toward softening those brutal realities. Meanwhile, slavery of blacks in the Americas is rightly treated with the full recognition of its brutality. Davis explains why such similar atrocities are treated differently. History is, often as not, our present politics projected onto the past. Davis wrote that in 2003, but since then the political climate that he referred to has only spread and become more infused into Western society. Activists in Western culture have organized society into groups of oppressors and oppressed, as if that hasn't been tried before. If you're an oppressed group, congratulations. You're rewarded with a phobe suffix that you can arbitrarily pin on your detractors in an attempt to silence them. In the West, Muslims take full advantage of this and of guilt culture more generally, with astonishing results. The history of slavery is a perfect example. Everyone in the West I have ever spoken to knows about the transatlantic slave trade. Nobody I have ever spoken to in the West who has not thoroughly studied Islam has ever heard of the Islamic slave trade. It's one of Islam's best kept secrets, but because the religion of Islam can be criticized only by risking the crime of Islamophobia, Western Muslims can make all kinds of claims about Islam as the religion that eradicated slavery. They can portray slavery as a Western problem and Islam as the solution. Do you agree with them? Or are you an Islamophobe? Or perhaps you believe that historical facts should be acknowledged regardless of the political climate. I, of course, believe the latter. So, let's look at 3 secrets of the Islamic slave trade. First, the Islamic slave trade was vast, both in numbers of slaves and in duration. John Azuma states, apart from this significantly high loss of life during the raids and the journey into servitude, he's referring to 1 slave being sold for every 10 killed. Conservative estimates suggest that between 11 and 14 million Africans were transported into Muslim lands outside tropical Africa over the past 14 centuries. The holiest city of Islam, Mecca, became the center of the slave trade in the world and remained so well into the 20th century. From there, slaves captured and brought from East Africa and the Sudan were distributed to all parts of Arabia and the Muslim world. Muslim legal scholar Bernard Freeman comments,
actually, if we look closely, more people were transported in the Indian Ocean slave trade than in the transatlantic slave trade, and over a much longer period of time, and there's a good argument that the Indian Ocean slave trade still exists today.
The Islamic slave trade therefore claimed millions of lives over many centuries. Number 2, the Islamic slave trade was associated with blackness. Muslim scholar Jonathan Brown notes, numerous scholars of Islamic history and slavery more broadly have pointed out the association of blackness and slavery in Islamic civilization, as well as the use of blackness to justify enslavement. Orlando Patterson would be one such scholar. He comments, a black skin in almost all the Islamic societies, including parts of the Sudan, was and still is associated with slavery. and Bernard Lewis gives some more background. Another attempt to justify the enslavement of a whole race is the Muslim adaptation of the biblical story of the curse of Ham. In the biblical version, Genesis 9, 1 through 27, the curse is servitude, not blackness, and it falls on Canaan, the youngest son of Ham, and not on his other sons, including Cush, later seen as ancestor of the blacks. The rationale of the story is obvious. The slaves of the Israelites were their near kinsmen, the Canaanites, and a religious, ideological, justification was required for their enslavement, hence the story of the curse of Canaan. The slaves of the Arabs were not Canaanites but blacks, so the curse was transferred to them, and blackness added to servitude as part of the hereditary burden. This story, though widespread, was by no means universally accepted. Ibn Khaldun and some other Arab writers reject it as absurd and attribute blackness to climatic and geographical factors. The idea, however, that blackness and slavery are somehow associated, as expressed in this story, was derived less from tradition than from reality. And finally, number 3, the Islamic slave trade has not been completely abolished. Here again from Bernard Freeman.
As I stand here today, slavery under Islamic law is permitted. It is still permitted.
But the Islamic slave trade has certainly slowed and transformed in recent decades. Was this because Islam had a moral awakening?
Unlike in the West, where we had a moral discourse about slavery, for good or for bad, that never happened in the Muslim world. So the ordinary Muslim has never really had to confront the moral problem with respect to slavery and the existence of slavery in the Islamic law. And so anti-slavery norms that we take for granted here in America oftentimes don't exist in the Islamic conception, in the Muslim conception.
Okay, so there was no moral awakening. It must have been something else. Freeman comments, this situation in the Hijaz did not change until 1962, when the new king, Faisal, under pressure from a very critical and ostensibly revolutionary regime in Egypt, as well as from the United States and the UK, announced that he was abolishing slavery in the kingdom, ordering the manumission of all slaves, and that the state would compensate those who deserve compensation. In point of fact, he did not abolish slavery, but rather simply ordered the emancipation of anyone enslaved in the kingdom. What situation is Freeman referring to? You heard it before from John Azuma. The holiest city of Islam, Mecca, became the center of the slave trade in the world, and remained so well into the 20th century. From there, slaves captured and brought from East Africa and the Sudan were distributed to all parts of Arabia and the Muslim world. Freeman puts it this way, the number of slaves in Hijaz can only be guessed. In 1930, they were said to make up 10% of the population of Mecca. The Hijazi regarded slaves as the most profitable and desirable investment. They were self-supporting and completely under their owners' control. Note that the West had its moral reckoning. The U.S. even fought a bloody war over the issue of slavery, and about 100 years after that, Saudi Arabia, the gatekeeper of the holiest city in Islam, simultaneously the slave capital, had to be coerced under international pressure from Western nations to address the problem of slavery. To summarize our third point, slavery in the Islamic world still has not been abolished.
What happens when Islam comes? Many Muslims think that Islam abolished slavery. It did not. I have a good friend of mine who said that's what his parents taught him when he was raised in Palestine, that Islam is opposed to slavery. There's an argument to that effect, but it did not abolish the practice.
Islam did not abolish slavery at its founding, contra the myth, and it still hasn't. The absence of moral discourse and public education on the problem of slavery in the Muslim world is therefore a significant cause for the surge in conditions analogous to slavery, and for revival of efforts to reinstate slavery and slave trading in the Islamic Middle East. Abolition remains an illusion. To To summarize, the Islamic slave trade was vast, associated with blackness, and has not been completely abolished. The victims of the Islamic slave trade deserve to be remembered, just like victims of other terrible historical tragedies. And there are lessons that need to be learned from the past. But these lessons aren't being learned in the Islamic world, and one cannot hope they will be, not when the Islamic slave trade itself continues. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time.